Okay, welcome to the deep dive. This deep dive is designed especially for you, and we've gathered a really interesting set of sources that you sent over. They all focus on, well, one of the most talked about and consistently praised dietary patterns around the Mediterranean diet.
That's right. Yeah, the source material we're digging into today is quite a mix. Research papers, reviews, it's fascinating stuff. We're looking at studies exploring how this way of eating might impact, common things like keeping weight off or managing blood sugar,
hmm
but also its potential role in areas like brain health, even breast cancer risk.
So our goal here, using these sources, is really to unpack all that. What are the key takeaways? Are there surprising insights about why the Mediterranean diet seems so consistently linked to, well, better health? Let's jump in and see what the research actually says.
Yeah, it should be quite a journey seeing how this one dietary approach, this pattern, pops up with potential benefits across so many different health areas.
Okay, so first things first. When researchers in these papers talk about the Mediterranean diet,
Well,
what are they actually studying? We hear the term all the time, but how is it defined scientifically?
Well, it actually traces back, interestingly, to the work of Ansel and Margaret Keyes back in the 1970s. They were really inspired by the traditional ways people ate in places like Crete, Greece, southern Italy, specifically what they saw back in the early 1960s.
Ah, okay. So it's based on a kind of snapshot from that time, a historical way of eating.
Exactly. And the specific pattern that's been sort of isolated and studied for these health benefits, it has some really clear components. It's defined by a very high intake of plant foods.
Right.
So think lots of vegetables, leafy greens often get singled out, especially when we talk about brain health later.
Uh-huh.
Fruits, and here sometimes the research points to berries specifically, or just fruit generally, plus legumes, nuts, whole grains, and crucially, the main source of fat is olive oil.
Heavy on the plants and olive oil, then. What about animal products? Meat, dairy.
They're definitely part of the picture, but in moderation. So moderate amounts of fish and seafood, poultry, eggs, and dairy, usually things like cheese and yogurt. And often, though modestly, wine, typically with meals.
Okay.
What's kept low then is red meat, processed meats, those refined carbs like white bread, sugary drinks, snacks, added sugars generally, and saturated fats from less healthy sources.
Got it. And it's probably worth mentioning, like the sources do, that this specific pattern they study, it isn't necessarily exactly how everyone in the Mediterranean region eats today, right?
Precisely. Modern diets have changed everywhere, but it's this defined, traditional, plant-forward, healthy fat pattern that the science keeps investigating for health outcomes.
Which brings us to the big picture. Before we dive into the specific studies, what's the general feeling, the consensus from the research you've looked at?
Well, the message that comes through really strongly across these sources is pretty clear. Consistently following this kind of pattern is associated with a reduced risk of overall mortality dying from any cause. Also, a lower risk of major heart problems like heart attacks and strokes, a reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and even a decreased risk for certain cancers.
Wow. So it's not just hitting one target. It seems to offer pretty broad protection against a lot of the big chronic diseases.
Absolutely. And that's really why you see it recommended so widely by major health organizations all over the world, groups like the American Heart Association, the American Diabetes Association. It's even included in the U.S. dietary guidelines. It's got some serious scientific backing from, decades of research.
Okay, that sets the stage nicely. Now, let's really get into the weeds with some specific findings from these sources you shared. First up, something that, let's face it, a lot of people struggle with. Maintaining weight loss. Losing weight is tough, sure, but keeping it off? That can feel like the real mountain to climb.
It's a huge challenge, and one of your sources, the MedWeight study, tackled this head on. They looked at 565 adults in Greece who had already successfully lost a fair bit of weight, at least 10% of their peak weight. And then they checked back in after at least a year to see who'd kept it off the maintainers and who had regained the regainers.
So what differences did they see just comparing those two groups initially?
Well, at first glance, the maintainers did look a bit different demographically and behaviorally. They tended to be younger, less often married. They had a lower current BMI, obviously.
Right.
They'd lost a higher percentage of weight initially, were more physically active, and reported sleeping a bit longer. Oh, and they also ate slightly more protein per kilogram of body weight.
Okay, so definitely a mix of factors involved in keeping weight off.
Hmm.
But where did the Mediterranean diet itself fit in?
This is where it gets really interesting, and I think a key insight from this particular study. While the sort of average Mediterranean diet score wasn't massively different between the two groups overall. The level of adherence was critical. What they found was that people with higher adherence scores specifically, those scoring in the top quarter for following the Mediterranean pattern, were about twice as likely to be in the weight loss maintainer group compared to those with lower scores.
Wait, hang on. Twice as likely, just by sticking more closely to this diet. That's a pretty strong link.
It really is, and what makes it compelling is that this association held up even after they statistically adjusted for all those other differences we mentioned, age, physical activity, even total calorie intake. They observed a clear linear trend. Basically, the better someone stuck to the Mediterranean pattern, the higher their odds of staying in the maintainer group.
Did they pinpoint any specific foods within the diet that seemed especially important for this maintenance effect?
They did break it down and look at individual components, and interestingly, fruit intake was the only single component that, on its own, showed a statistically significant link with better odds of maintenance.
It's a food.
Yeah, for every extra weekly serving of fruit someone reported eating, their odds of being a maintainer went up by about 3%.
Okay, so fruit seems to have a specific role there.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier it's more about the overall pattern.
That's definitely the broader message the researchers emphasized. They did this kind of cool statistical check called a leave one out analysis.
Okay, what's that?
Think of it like this. They took the total Mediterranean diet score and then recalculated its connection to weight maintenance, but each time they temporarily removed the influence of one key food group, like taking out fruits or legumes or olive oil, one by one.
I see.
And what they found was that when they removed the contribution of certain core components, specifically potatoes, fruit, legumes, olive oil, red meat, and alcohol, that strong link between the overall diet score and successful maintenance, it mostly vanished.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So taking out one key piece often broke the chain, suggesting the real benefit comes from the synergy, how all these foods work together, rather than just one magic ingredient.
Yeah.
Although, as you said, fruit did stand out on its own, too.
Exactly. It points towards the whole dietary pattern providing the main advantage for keeping weight off long term. And the proposed reasons? Well, things like the high fiber and water content in many Mediterranean foods.
Right, feeling full.
Exactly. Satiety, low energy density, appetite control. Protein, too, which maintainers ate more of per kilo, also boosts satiety. And perhaps, as the study hints, eating more fruit might simply displace less healthy snacks.
It is an association study, of course, so it shows a link, not necessarily cause and effect.
True, the cross-sectional nature is a limitation.
But finding that stronger adherence correlates with double the likelihood of success, even after accounting for other lifestyle factors. That's a pretty compelling argument for this pattern's role in weight maintenance.
Definitely. It really strengthens the case for recommending this approach for people trying to keep weight off.
Okay, let's switch gears now. Diabetes management. Huge topic. Lots of talk about low-carb diets for blood sugar. Your sources included a really interesting Stanford study that put two different low-carb approaches head-to-head.
Yes, this was a very well-designed study. It was a randomized crossover trial, and they recruited people who already had type 2 diabetes or prediabetes. They then compared two diets, an ultra-low-carb ketogenic diet versus a, well, still low-carb but less restrictive Mediterranean diet.
And participants actually tried both diets.
Yeah, that's the crossover part. Everyone did each diet for 12 weeks with a washout period in between. It's a strong design because each person serves as their own comparison, which helps control for individual variations.
Okay, smart. So what were the big results? How did they compare on things like blood sugar control, weight loss?
Well, this was maybe the most striking finding. Both diets were similarly effective on the main clinical markers they measured. Both groups saw comparable improvements in HbA1c. That's the key measure of long-term blood sugar control. They also both lost a similar amount of weight, roughly 7-8% of their body weight on average over the 12 weeks. Fasting insulin, fasting glucose, those improved similarly too. And HDL, the good cholesterol, went up on both diets.
So for the major metabolic goals they were tracking,
Yeah.
it was basically a draw, at least in the short term.
Pretty much, yeah. The differences were quite small. LDL cholesterol, the bad kind, actually ticked up slightly on the keto diet, whereas it went down a bit on the Mediterranean diet.
Interesting.
Triglycerides, another blood fat, dropped on both, but the decrease was slightly larger on keto.
Okay, so maybe a tiny edge to med on LDL, tiny edge to keto on triglycerides, but the overall metabolic picture looked very similar. Where did they see significant differences then?
This is really crucial, I think, nutrient intake. Because the keto diet is so restrictive about carbs, cutting out entire food groups,
Right.
participants on that diet phase consumed significantly less of several important nutrients, things like fiber, thiamine, vitamin B6, vitamin C, D, and E. These are nutrients primarily found in the plant foods that keto restricts. The only nutrient that was actually higher on the keto diet was vitamin B12, likely due to higher meat intake.
So hold on. The Mediterranean approach delivered pretty much the same clinical benefits, but with a much better nutrient profile.
That's exactly it. It allowed for more fruits, legumes, whole grains foods packed with nutrients that are heavily restricted or eliminated on a strict keto diet.
What about actually sticking to the diets? Adherence must have been a factor.
Oh, definitely. The study actually provided pre-made meals for the first 4 weeks of each diet arm, and during that time, adherence was pretty high for both.
Makes sense if someone else is making the food.
Right. But then, when participants had to switch to planning and cooking their own meals for the remaining 8 weeks, adherence dropped off for both, but especially for keto. The researchers specifically noted that participants found the keto diet more polarizing and generally harder, more restrictive to follow long term.
Yeah, I can imagine. Cutting out entire food groups like fruits, grains, beans, that's a big lifestyle change. It can be socially tricky.
Absolutely. And maybe the most telling finding came after the main study period ended.
Oh, what happened then?
They followed up with the participants 3 months later just to see that they were eating naturally. And overwhelmingly, people had gravitated back towards a Mediterranean style of eating, not the keto style. Even people who did really well on keto during the trial, who stuck to it perfectly, many of them abandoned it afterwards and shifted towards the Mediterranean approach.
Wow. So the science showed similar short-term results, but real life showed that the Mediterranean pattern was just more sustainable, more appealing long-term.
That's the big takeaway here, I think. The study suggests that going to the extreme carb restriction of keto didn't really offer any extra overall health advantages for managing diabetes or prediabetes compared to the more moderate, low-carb Mediterranean approach. The real benefits seem to stem from what they both do well: cutting down on added sugars and refined grains and eating plenty of vegetables. The Mediterranean diet achieves that without needing to eliminate nutrient-dense foods like fruit and whole grains that people clearly find easier and more enjoyable to eat consistently over time.
That is a really powerful insight. It suggests focusing on reducing the genuinely unhealthy carbs and sugars and loading up on whole plant foods rather than aiming for extreme, potentially nutrient-poor and hard-to-maintain levels of restriction.
Precisely. It really highlights the importance of sustainability for achieving lasting health benefits.
Okay, let's pivot again, this time to the brain. Your sources included research looking at this diet in relation to brain health, specifically thinking about Alzheimer's disease.
Yes, this was a fascinating study, supported in part by the National Institute on Aging. What they did was track the diets of hundreds of older adults over many years for more than a decade. But what made it really stand out was that these participants agreed to donate their brains for research after they passed away. So the researchers could actually look directly at the brain tissue for the physical signs of Alzheimer's disease.
Wow. Okay, so not just cognitive tests, but actual brain pathology, like the plaques and tangles.
Exactly. They looked for amyloid plaques, the sticky protein clumps and neurofibrillary tangles, the twisted tau protein fibers, which are the hallmarks of Alzheimer's in the brain.
And what did they find when they correlated diet with what they saw in the brain tissue?
They found that people who reported higher adherence to both the Mediterranean diet and also the MIND diet.
What's the MIND diet, quickly?
Yes. The MIND diet is sort of a hybrid. It combines aspects of the Mediterranean diet and another pattern called the DDIS diet, but with a specific focus on foods thought to be especially good for brain health. Things like berries and leafy green vegetables get extra emphasis.
Got it. So higher adherence to Mediterranean and MIND diets was linked to
Was associated with fewer signs of Alzheimer's pathology in their brains after death.
fewer plaques and tangles.
Well, interestingly, the link was primarily with lower levels of amyloid plaques. The association with tau tangles wasn't as clear or strong in this particular study.
That's a specific finding. Amyloid plaques are often thought to develop earlier in the disease process.
That's right. And they did also highlight specific foods. Green leafy vegetables, in particular, showed a notable association with less amyloid pathology when they looked at individual components.
So maybe Popeye was onto something for brain health, too.
It certainly adds to the evidence for leafy greens. And importantly, this link between diet and lower amyloid pathology held up even when they accounted for other lifestyle factors that could influence brain health, things like education level, how much physical activity people did, smoking status, and so on.
So it wasn't just explained away by other healthy habits.
No. And while, again, it's an observational study showing a correlation, not proving cause, finding this connection between reported diet and actual physical evidence of disease pathology in the brain tissue years later, that's a pretty powerful piece of the puzzle. It really reinforces why diet is such an important area of research for Alzheimer's prevention strategies.
Absolutely. Seeing that potential link right down to the tissue level is quite striking. Okay, so we've covered weight maintenance, diabetes, brain health. Let's tackle one more major area from your sources: breast cancer.
Yes, a really critical area. Breast cancer is, as you know, incredibly common and sadly a leading cause of cancer death for women worldwide. The review source you shared starts by setting the context. Diet and obesity are known significant risk factors. High intake of fruits and vegetables is generally seen as protective, whereas things like red meat consumption and alcohol intake are linked to increased risk.
So how does the Mediterranean diet pattern fit into that complex picture, according to the review?
Well, the review synthesizes evidence from a lot of different studies, and the general conclusion is that greater adherence to the Mediterranean diet pattern is linked to a lower risk of developing breast cancer overall.
Okay.
They mentioned findings from various study types, like large observational studies suggesting, say, a 9% lower risk for each step up in diet adherence score, or even results from one specific clinical trial where women assigned to follow a Mediterranean diet with extra olive oil had a significantly lower incidence of breast cancer compared to a control group.
So evidence pointing that way from different angles. Although you mentioned the review also notes some variability. Not every single study finds a clear link.
That's a really important nuance, yes. Research findings aren't always perfectly consistent across every single study. Methodological differences, populations studied, things like that can lead to some discrepancies in the literature. It's not always a slam dunk in every single piece of research cited.
Understood. But the review seemed to go deeper into the why, right? The potential biological reasons how this diet might influence cancer risk.
Exactly. And this is where it gets really fascinating, looking at the potential molecular mechanisms. How could what you eat actually affect something like cancer development at a cellular level?
Yeah, let's get into that. What are some of those proposed mechanisms?
Okay, so several interconnected factors seem to be at play. First, and this ties back to things we've already touched on, are the powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects of the diet.
Right.
Components found abundantly in olive oil, fruits, vegetables, things like polyphenols, healthy fatty acids. They can help calm chronic, low-grade inflammation and reduce oxidative stress, which is damage from unstable molecules in the body. Both inflammation and oxidative stress are known to fuel cancer development.
Okay.
The review even mentions studies showing that adhering to the diet can lower blood levels of specific inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, or CRP, and certain cytokines like IL-6 and TNF-alpha.
So it's basically creating a less pro-cancer environment inside the body.
Less?
Less welcoming for abnormal cells.
That's a good way to put it. It's helping to dampen down those harmful background processes. Then there's evidence it influences gene expression.
How so?
Well, compounds in the diet, especially polyphenols from plants, seem able to interact with our genes, turning some up, some down in ways that affect cell growth, proliferation, and spread. For instance, compounds in olive oil might inhibit certain pathways, like the NF-kappa B pathway, which promotes cell survival and growth, while potentially encouraging apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, basically, telling abnormal or damaged cells to self-destruct, a really crucial anti-cancer mechanism.
Wow. So it's potentially influencing the cell's own instruction manual and machinery.
It seems that way. Another angle is glycemic control. We talked about this with diabetes. The diet's focus on whole foods, high fiber, lower glycemic index carbs helps keep blood sugar and insulin levels more stable.
Right.
And chronically high insulin levels have been linked to increased risk and worse prognosis for several cancers, including some types of breast cancer. So keeping insulin steady is likely beneficial.
And that links back directly to the Stanford study findings, too.
Exactly. These mechanisms overlap. Then there's the gut microbiota, the trillions of bacteria in our gut. This diet, being rich in fiber and diverse plant compounds, fosters a healthier, more diverse gut microbial community.
The gut again. It keeps coming up.
It really does seem central to so much. A healthy gut microbiome is increasingly linked to lower breast cancer risk. It can modulate inflammation throughout the body, influence immune function, and maybe even affect the stability of our DNA in cells elsewhere.
Fascinating. Any other mechanisms?
One more mentioned is hormonal regulation. There's some evidence, particularly in postmenopausal women, that the Mediterranean diet might help decrease circulating levels of certain estrogens. Since many breast cancers are hormone receptor positive, meaning their growth is fueled by estrogen,
Uh-huh.
having lower, healthier estrogen levels could be protective.
So it's really like a multi-pronged attack, hitting inflammation, genes, blood sugar, gut health, maybe even hormones. It's not just one thing, but a whole systemic effect.
Precisely. It paints a picture of the diet influencing health through multiple interconnected biological pathways. And importantly, the review didn't just focus on preventing breast cancer, it also looked at potential benefits for patients and survivors already diagnosed.
Oh, okay. How might adopting this diet help people who are actually living with or recovering from breast cancer?
Well, studies suggest that adherence to the Mediterranean diet is associated with improved quality of life for breast cancer patients and survivors. It might help manage some treatment side effects, reduce symptoms like fatigue, pain, inflammation, improve physical functioning, mood, and just overall well-being during and after treatment.
That sounds incredibly valuable, just making the journey less arduous.
Absolutely, it can provide significant support. And beyond quality of life, there's also some emerging evidence, though the review notes more research is needed here, suggesting that following this pattern might potentially improve response to treatments and even reduce the risk of the cancer recurring or progressing later on.
That's huge.
Yeah.
A potentially life-altering benefit.
Yeah.
So, acknowledging the variability in some study results that you mentioned, the overall thrust from the sources seems to be that this dietary pattern is a potentially powerful tool both for lowering risk in the first place and for supporting people affected by breast cancer.
It really does seem that way. When you look across all these different areas we've discussed, weight maintenance, metabolic health and diabetes, brain health, and now breast cancer risk, and support this Mediterranean dietary pattern consistently emerges as being linked to positive outcomes.
And it keeps circling back to that core definition we started with, doesn't it?
Exactly. The science really reinforces that the power probably doesn't lie in isolating one superfood, but in the overall combination, the synergy. Prioritizing lots of different plant foods, relying on healthy fats like olive oil, moderate protein from fish, poultry, dairy, eggs, and crucially, minimizing the highly processed foods, refined grains, and added sugars.
Yeah, it really echoes that finding from the Stanford Diabetes study, too, that you can achieve significant health improvements with this balanced whole food approach without resorting to extreme, potentially nutrient-poor, and difficult-to-sustain restrictions. It's more about crowding in the good stuff.
It seems the benefits arise from the whole package deal, the cumulative impact of these food choices on our body's complex systems.
So as we kind of bring this deep dive into the science of the Mediterranean diet to a close, based on the sources you shared.
I think the research provides a really solid foundation for its stellar reputation. It's validated as a genuinely beneficial way of eating, linked not just to potentially preventing major illnesses, but also to supporting better quality of life and possibly even better outcomes for people dealing with various health challenges.
And the magic, it seems, is in the pattern itself, the components working together.
Yeah, what's truly remarkable when you look across these studies is how a relatively simple approach to eating, focusing on whole, plant-centric foods that humans have eaten for centuries, can apparently exert such complex and wide-ranging effects right down to the molecular level, influencing gene expression, inflammation, gut bugs, hormones.
It really drives home how fundamental the relationship is between what we choose to put in our mouths and the intricate, delicate balance of the systems running our bodies.
It absolutely does. Which leads to maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to ponder. If this way of eating, grounded in simple, nourishing whole foods, demonstrably holds such profound potential according to the science, well, what's one small, achievable step you might consider taking towards embracing more of this pattern in your own life, maybe starting this week?